Hey everyone, I wanted to take a second and introduce myself. My name is Adam Knapp. For some of you, I haven't actually been your teacher. Only the 11th graders had me during the regular year. But for the remainder of the year, I'm going to be your Bible teacher for grades 9 through 12. Just to give you some background on who I am, or some things about me, I am married. My wife's name is Lisa. We have 5 children. Some of you know my older children, Brooklyn, who just turned 9, and Mila. But we also have Judah and Eli and Shiloh. And so we came down here in June of 2019, June 1st. And so we've been here now almost a year, coming up to that year mark as we finish up the next 2 months. And I didn't even know that VCA existed until I think mid-July or early July. So that's a little bit about how I got down here, my background, my education, just so you have some idea why I'm teaching Bible. I did an undergrad in biblical studies, Master of Arts in Religion and Church Ministries, and then I also did a Master of Divinity in Theological Studies. And so between all of those, I spent about 9 years in college, both in undergrad and graduate work. And afterwards, I spent the next roughly four, almost 5 years working as an elder and youth and young adult pastor in Lynchburg, Virginia, as well as a chaplain for an ICE immigration facility. And so between these two things, I found myself doing a lot of ministry in very different settings amongst young people and young adults, anywhere from 12 to 30, as well as amongst those that were in prison or being held, detained until they could be released. And so that gives you some idea, some of my background in ministry. I've also had the opportunity to travel up and down the East Coast speaking, as well as playing in different venues and events musically. And so I've had a really good time serving the Lord and doing ministry, and I find that this is now another interesting aspect of my life, that I'm a Bible teacher to all of you. Now, in the beginning of the packet, we discussed the authorship of John's Gospel and it being John, and we discussed a little bit about what the world would have been like. Most scholars agree, and church history agrees, that John would have been the last of the 4 Gospels written. There's debate whether or not Matthew or Mark were the first, but John, most scholars put later. And so in that, when we start to think about John being later written, John's writing to different issues. He's addressing different problems than those that would have been writing at the beginning part of the century, the first century. Many believe that John may have been addressing some heresies that were beginning to develop, potentially the rise or the beginning of Gnosticism. And most put his writing sometime in the 90s AD. Now we know that when John was called, he was called with his brother James, the sons of Zebedee, and he was called as a teenager. That could have put him anywhere from 13 to 17. And so some of you even now may be older than John was when he began to walk with Jesus, when he was there at Cana and at the wedding feast and saw the first miracles of Jesus. Some of you would have been older than he was at that time. And so John, some of the reasons why we believe that, one, John was always paired with Peter, which most church history and scholars believe was the oldest of the 12. Why he spoke up first, why he was always asked, why they looked to him as a leader, because within first century Jewish culture, being older or being an elder carried a certain level of respect and significant weight. And so John being partnered with him would imply maybe perhaps that the older was watching out for the youngest. The other just is church history and tradition and how long John would have lived. If John would have been in his 30s or 40s, in the 30s AD, there's no way he could have written in the 90s. Someone living to 90 or 100 would have been nearly unthinkable in the first century. And John himself lived to be very old. As your packet reported, Tertullian, one of the church fathers, said that John had survived being boiled alive to be sent to Patmos. And there at Patmos, he is encountered by God and has his revelation, what we know as the book of Revelation. And then from there returns to Ephesus, the church that Paul planted, where Timothy is now the senior leader or the apostle that's overseeing it, and John spends the rest of his days there. John's writing to a primarily Gentile audience as well. Something worth considering that Matthew, when he writes, Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience. He's writing for a Jewish perspective. But John is writing for a very different, a very Gentile perspective. That's why even as you look at the opening of the book, there's a certain dynamic of philosophy that's fitted in there. And, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And this idea of light and the Word and all these different pictures and motifs carry with them a certain level of Gentile influence, or what would have been how Gentiles would have thought, thinking of terms of the Logos going all the way back to the time of Plato. And so with that being said, John is not writing this gospel living high on the hog. He's not writing it going through the greatest season of his life. He's writing it as a man that has lived through some of the hardest persecution the church had ever known. A man who had buried his friends under Nero's hand. Peter being crucified upside down, Paul being beheaded, and thousands of others being tortured. He himself later being tortured, being imprisoned, we read in Acts. So John has a dynamic in his life where he has experienced persecution, where he has experienced difficulty, and yet he's continued to follow the Lord. And so then he writes to us and he begins to tell us what it is to know who Jesus is. And he begins to talk about how he's known him, how he's handled him, how he's the disciple whom Jesus loved. At the same time, not letting go of humor, it's interesting when they're running back from the tomb. John decides to make sure it's known and written down that he outran Peter and he ran faster. Sometimes those things just pop out and they're a little bit funny. Things that an author would do to remember his friend Peter and the circumstances surrounding Jesus' resurrection. But the goal, the main point of this is that you would take time to start thinking through that lens, to think what it would have been like at a time right now when our world is unique, when there's a pandemic and there's chaos and we're told to stay home and essential workers are this but not that, and all of the chaos that abounds. You could begin to understand what it must have been like for Christians who had an illegal faith, who had to meet in private, who if caught meeting could be tortured and could be killed, who could be asked to bow to Caesar, and then when they said no, could face the penalty of that. And so I want you to be considering that as you read this book and as you read what Jesus told them about giving up their lives and following him and laying down their preferences and taking up their cross. This is not someone writing that doesn't know it intimately, that doesn't know it personally, and that hasn't done it himself. So as we continue on, I want you all just to keep your eyes focused on what John is trying to say about who Jesus is and then who Jesus defines himself to be. As we go through the rest of these weeks, we're going to find a beautiful picture of Jesus and the fact that he's come to reconcile us to his Father and restore us into right relationship with God. Anyhow, guys, I hope you're doing good today. I hope you're enjoying your week. Keep your head up and look forward to more videos. God bless. Bye.